Now looking at the Bleeding Green Nation, aka the Philadelphia Eagles, starting at the quarterback room, Carson Wentz is the best quarterback in the division, and what he did with no wide receivers last year was extremely impressive, and hopefully with actual wide receivers and with the moves Howie Roseman has made, that can be a pretty big leap forward. Jalen Hurts will probably fill the Taysom Hill sort of role, and Nate Sudfeld is a solid developmental guy. The loss of Josh McCown is a pretty big one in my opinion. I think he was a really good teacher for Carson Wentz, and hopefully they bring him back as a coach. But overall, this quarterback room is pretty good. Now looking at the running back room, Miles Sanders is poised to have a huge breakout season in 2020. Boston Scott played really well in the roles he was given. They ended up re-signing Corey Clement, and there are rumblings in the wind that they could potentially sign Carlos Hyde or another veteran running back. Knock on wood, hopefully it is Shady McCoy because I want him to retire as an Eagle. They did lose Jordan Howard to the Miami Dolphins, and while he did play really well, giving Miles Sanders the benefit of the doubt and giving him more touches will only benefit this offense. Miles Sanders and Boston Scott are both really good receiving backs as well, and I think they complement each other really well. Now looking at a wide receiver corp that was decimated with injuries, I think this wide receiver group could take a big leap forward in 2020. They drafted Jalen Reagor, who can really fill in that speed role that this offense has desperately been looking for. They lost Nelson Aguilar to sign for a really cheap deal, almost $1 million for a one-year deal with the Las Vegas Raiders. And while he did bring some speed, I think it was time for us to part with him. He and his drop issues were really annoying. Alshon Jeffrey is poised to make a comeback after having a Liz Frank injury in his leg and his foot particularly. He declined slightly in 2019, but hopefully when he comes back he can be a pretty good contributor for this team, and rumors have it that he is going to be a focus point for this wide receiver corp this year. Deshaun Jackson, when he was on the field, this offense was remarkable. Without him, it was less than stellar. Deshaun Jackson comes back and he can bring in some more speed that this offense has desperately been missing. This offense with him was completely different. Jay Jaw, aka JJ Arthega-Whiteside, he is looking to fill in the Alshon Jeffrey role, and with Alshon being there, it's not really looking good for him. The only way he could potentially get playing time is if Alshon gets hurt. I think JJ did play injured, and that is definitely something to keep in mind. And he was essentially told to play every single wide receiver position, and he claims that was hard for him to learn them all, and he wasn't able to stay fixed and learn one position. And we'll see if he can take a second year forward. I'm not extremely hopeful, but I think he will be a contributor in 2020. Maybe put up 500 yards or so and improve over his rookie year. Marquise Goodwin was traded from the San Francisco 49ers. He's another speedster, and he's literally an Olympic sprinter. So Howie Roseman really prioritized speed. And if you look at some of the more draft picks he made later in the rounds, he drafted John Hightower and Quez Watkins, both who are known as some of the faster guys in college football. He really prioritized speed, and you can see what Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson both thought they were missing in the offense. When you look at the slot wide receiver, I think Greg Ward could potentially be one of the better slot wide receivers in this division. He really stood out in his playing time, and he was one of the standout performers in 2019. Overall, I think this wide receiver corp is heavily improved, and with Alshon and Deshaun coming back from injury, I think the depth here leaves this as potentially the best wide receiver corps, though it doesn't have the starting three that the Dallas Cowboys do. So I will notch them just slightly because of that. Now, when you look at tight end, you have potentially the best tight end room in the league with All-Pro Zach Ertz. He has been one of the biggest security blankets in the league and really reliable. He is that wide receiver one for that offense. After him, you have Dallas Goedert, who they drafted right before Dallas. I think Eagles fans love to remember that we stole him from them. Dallas Goedert is one of the better young tight ends in the league, and he has true top 10 potential. He does have some frustrating drops here and there where you'd like to see him come down with it. But that being said, he also makes some remarkable catches that Zach Ertz doesn't really make, at least anymore. Dallas Goedert is also a really good pass blocking tight end, and you want to see that in one of the best tight end rooms in the league. Josh Perkins was another guy who stood out later in the year after all the injuries, and he was another almost standout tight end coming up and having a pretty good chemistry with Carson Wentz. Overall, this tight end room is one of the best in the NFL. Now moving to offensive line, this might be one of the positions that took the biggest hit. They lost Jason Peters, who is a future Hall of Famer, and there are rumblings that we might re-sign him, but there are also rumblings that he might go to the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns, and as of the making of this video, he has not signed yet, and I'm going to make the assumption that he will not re-sign with the Eagles. That leaves second-year player Andre Dillard to fill in at left tackle, and he filled in admirably whenever he played left tackle. Lots of the fan base are against him currently, which I don't understand. The few games he did start at left tackle, you didn't even hear his name, and that's what you want to hear from an offensive lineman. He suffered when you played him at right tackle, and I don't think he can by any means play that position. But left tackle is where he's comfortable at, and he could potentially be an anchor piece going in the future. They lost Big V, aka Halapoulivaati Vaitai, to a 5-year, $50 million contract to the Detroit Lions. He was a very versatile player, and everything he did, he was pretty good at. I don't think he was by any means a star, but the versatility is going to be missed in this Philadelphia Eagles offensive line that has prided themselves on being one of the deepest offensive lines in the league. Looking at left guard, they have Isaac Seumalo, who, while underperforming early in the year, ended up being one of the better players on this offensive line later on. I don't think he's by any means a star, but he is not a hole by any means either. At center, you have All-Pro Jason Kelce, one of, if not the best centers in the league. And at right tackle and right guard, you have Brandon Brooks and Lane Johnson, both who are All-Pros, making this the best offensive line in the division by a mile. In the draft, they drafted Jack Briscoe and Prince Tega Wanega, both from Auburn, and they were predicted to go way earlier, and they have true backup potential. They could potentially fill in that Big V role. Nate Hedberg is one of the more interesting center prospects in the backup world in the NFL, and Jordan Mailata has been a project player up to this point, and I don't see much from him there. I honestly think we might cut him going on later. Matt Pryor filled in admirably after injuries forced him to come into play, and overall this is one of the deepest offensive lines in the league, as well as being one of the best starting five as well. I really like this offensive line, and when you want to build an offensive line, look at what the Philadelphia Eagles have done, consistently putting in draft picks and big money in these players to protect their quarterback and open up a really good ground game for the running backs. Now looking at defensive line, it's hard to get much better than having Fletcher Cox as your interior defensive tackle, but they went out and signed Javon Hargrave from the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the key to knowing if a player is really good is to see whether or not the fan base of their team reacts when he's gone, and the Pittsburgh Steelers fans were extremely mad that he ended up signing with the other Pennsylvania team. Both these players need to be double teamed, and the fact is you can't spend 4 players on protecting just 2. You have to leave one of these guys single covered, and it's probably going to end up being Javon Hargrave who ends up being single covered, and he will probably wreak havoc. You have 2 studs there. Malik Jackson was also the big free agency signing from the 2019 offseason, and he will come back from his foot injury and be a really good key member of that defensive tackle rotation. Sean Ridgway was another okay guy, and Bruce Hector as well, and both filled in admirably after injury forced them to come in. Overall, the interior defensive line is one of the better ones in the NFL. They did end up losing Vinny Curry to free agency, and he was one of the better run stuffers in the league. But I think bringing in Javon Hargrave is a direct improvement. Derek Barnett missed a ton of games with a shoulder injury, and he's one of the more promising younger defensive players in the league. I think he's a solid player, and he hasn't flashed completely, but he could potentially have a breakout year going into 2020. Brandon Graham is still very much a stud, and while he is a PFF darling, he does make an impact pretty consistently. Overall, in 2019, that defensive line was sort of underwhelming. They weren't developing the same amount of pressure, and that was probably because Fletcher Cox was playing hurt and Derek Barnett was gone. Hopefully they can take a step forward after hopefully being healthy and also bringing in some pretty big name guys. Josh Sweat was another pretty solid depth guy who stood out in the limited time he was given. And they traded for Jannard Avery with the Cleveland Browns in a midseason trade. He's really undersized, and I don't understand this trade at all. He's more of a linebacker than sort of a pure rushing defensive end. I don't understand this move by Howie Roseman at all. He will probably be a disappointment, and I don't like this move at all. Overall, this defensive line, it has pretty solid depth overall and pretty solid starters. One of the best defensive lines, if not the best defensive line in the NFC East. Now looking at linebacker, this team is probably severely going to miss Nigel Bradham after releasing him for opening up some cap space. Nate Gary was solid and played pretty solid in his third rookie year. I really liked what I saw from him after getting multiple picks. TJ Edwards is a guy who is a darling of the coaching staff, but honestly, I don't see much in him. Jatavis Brown is probably good enough, but again, he's a guy who was released and by the LA Chargers. It is worrisome that they didn't really re-sign him, and he's also sort of a more undersized guy. Duke Riley is just meh. He hasn't really shown much in his career. Jannard Avery might end up playing more of a linebacker role, but again, he didn't stand out much in the role that he was given in Cleveland. They ended up drafting Davion Taylor, the linebacker, in the third round. He's more of a speedster hybrid role, sort of an undersized, similar to Jatavis Brown. I like the pick, but overall, this linebacking core is probably the worst in the division. They are lacking at superstar potential, and they're also lacking overall in depth. I don't like this group at all completely. And overall, when I look at this linebacking group, they are going to have to benefit from a really strong defensive end and defensive pass rush as a whole, and hopefully from some improved pass coverage. When you look at the cornerback room, they traded for Darius Slay from the Detroit Lions, and he is still very much a superstar player. Even while he's getting closer to the age of 30, he is a huge improvement over whatever they had starting as their cornerback one, and he will follow those wide receiver ones on a weekly basis. Avonte Maddox is a pretty solid guy, and he's probably going to start on the outside. He did have a slight decline from 2018 to 2019, but hopefully he picks that up. They ended up signing Nickel Roby-Coleman from the Rams in free agency as well, and he will most likely play the nickel role and be a really good slot corner for them. Sidney Jones has overall disappointed, but late in the season when he was thrust into the roles due to injury, he ended up making some of the bigger plays, essentially clutching both the late season New York Giants game and the late season Dallas Cowboys game with pass breaks up. He is working with some DB gurus as well, and he could very much have a bounce back year in his fourth year. Rasul Douglas is a pretty good guy, and he's really good against those bigger, slower wide receivers, but he has been shown to have some sort of just an overall lack of speed when it comes to him running and getting completely run past, and he has shown up in trade rumors, so it is questionable whether or not he will end up even making the roster. That being said, he did take a pay cut to hopefully make the roster for him, and overall, I like the depth here. Crevon LeBlanc is another guy who has a dog in him. He has that dog mentality, and he will come in and play pretty admirably wherever he ends up playing. Craig James really is nothing to talk about. He did make a huge play in that Green Bay Packers game, essentially winning that game, but he is not a guy you want to be talking about at all. Overall, this cornerback room is improved, and if Sidney Jones and Avonte Maddox can take leaps forward, and you could very much have one of the more improved cornerbacks rooms in the league with Darius Slay and Nickel Roby-Coleman being a pretty solid corner and essentially filling in that Patrick Robinson role from the 2017 Super Bowl team. Now, when you're looking at safety, this team is going to really regret letting go of Malcolm Jenkins. He played literally 2 or 3 years in a row without missing a snap and playing special team snaps as well. He was a really good hybrid Mike linebacker, almost sort of filling in as a hybrid linebacker safety. He played every single position you wanted to play, whether it be slot corner, deep safety, closer to the line of scrimmage safety, linebacker, and he was a really consistent tackler as well. They did end up drafting Kayvon Wallace in the 4th round, who was probably the best pick in the Philadelphia Eagles draft. I really like our record with Clemson safeties as well, seeing as we drafted Brian Dawkins. I by no means think K'Wan Wallace would be a Brian Dawkins, but he was graded as one of the best safeties in college football. Rodney McLeod was re-signed, and he will play that deep safety role that he has excelled at. And they brought back Joan Mills, and he will play that sort of hybrid safety role. And after being positioned, he played that in college back in LSU, and I am pretty confident he will be pretty solid at safety. They brought in Will Parks from the Denver Broncos as another hybrid safety sort of role. Rudy Ford and Marcus Epps are both developmental sort of solid depth guys. And overall, this safety room is very interesting because it's a ton of guys who can play almost every single position. I'm very much undecided on the safety group. I think the loss of Malcolm Jenkins is going to be a huge one, but it will be interesting to see what Jim Schwartz does with all these hybrid players. And when you look at the special teams group, Jake Elliott has been one of the better, more consistent kickers in the league, and Cameron Johnson has been one of the better young punters in the league as well. Overall, this roster is tied with the Dallas Cowboys. I think they're more talented as in when it comes to depth, but when you're just looking purely at starters, the Dallas Cowboys probably have them beat.